Sorry, good morning, everyone. That's much better. My name is Daniel Materu. I'm a partner at Deloitte. I lead our technology and transformation team, and it's a real pleasure to be with you here today. I've been involved in the innovation ecosystem in Tanzania for around 10 plus years now, and it's really exciting to see how far it's come. So today I've been invited to share with you a few insights on the study that Deloitte supported the FUNGUO program on around the enterprise support organizations in Tanzania. It's a landscape study, and as you can see, the title is Catalyst for Growth, a landscape study for entrepreneur support organizations in Tanzania. In terms of the agenda of what we're going to walk through, I have a very tight 10 minutes, so it's just going to be highlights. And if you just move on to the next slide, we'll walk you through the key highlights. So we'll just touch on the background in terms of what our approach was in conducting this study. We'll also look at the actual findings, the ESOs that we mapped in Tanzania. We'll look at what works well, but also some of the capacity gaps and finish with recommendations. So I will move a little bit quickly, but I hope it won't be too quick. So starting off with the study itself. So UNDP did engage Deloitte to conduct this study. The focus is on three main objectives. One is to identify who are these entrepreneur support organizations in Tanzania. So just mapping them in terms of the landscape. Second was to identify some of the capability gaps. One thing that where we observe is that there's a misalignment between what these ESO organizations are providing in terms of support and technical assistance and what startups need. So what are some of these gaps and what are the root causes? That's something we looked at. And finally, what are some of the opportunities and recommendations? In conducting this study, we had to be clear on how we identify ESOs. And so the definition that we used were entities that support, train, mentor, and sometimes fund entrepreneurs and startups, a big focus on startups, to develop, scale, and sustain viable businesses. We had three phases. We started with the first phase just to establish a methodological framework. We then did data collection and then validation. In data collection, did both secondary and primary research. In the primary side, interviews over 25, 26, 8 focus group discussions with both startups and ESOs. We did a deep dive in 3 specific ESOs to look at their organizational capacity through a more detailed lens. And we also conducted 2 surveys, one on ESOs and one on startups, to get some quantifiable data, and finished, of course, with validating with ecosystem stakeholders. And some of the stakeholders we engaged, I can see in the room today, and so we really appreciated your input in this study. So what was the outcome? Starting off, we did identify 87 ESOs in Tanzania across different categories. So incubators, accelerators, we also had hubs, interest groups and associations, business development service providers, as well as co-working spaces. So I know the text is very small here. So if we go to the next slide, we share a little bit more insights on what the actual categories are. And one of the main themes that we saw is there's quite a big focus at the moment when we look at ESOs in terms of the early stage support organization. So I think Joseph mentioned earlier the missing middle and a trend that we see in Tanzania and the region. And this is also evident when we look at the ESO landscape. With respect to that, you'll notice that innovation hubs are at 49% of the 87. And then the next highest category is accelerators and incubators, around 13 and 14%. And then you have your interest groups. We do want to acknowledge that there is an ESO specific interest or group or association, the Tanzania Hubs Network, which is a big plus, but also other associations like the Startup Association, which also supports ESOs and professional bodies as well. Some other insights in terms of the types. We also saw a trend in terms of university-based ESOs. having a relatively high number. So in terms of quantity, especially when it comes to hubs, as well as incubators. We also observed that now we're seeing a little bit more involvement from corporates, with some of the larger banks establishing incubators, which is also a big step forward. You know, if I reflect on when I started engaging the ecosystem around 10 years ago, I know there's been a number of landscape studies, and you'll find that hubs were more prominent back then. So now we're seeing a little bit more diversity, but still a need to focus a little bit more on the missing middle and the ESOs that support startups that are scaling. And if we move on to the next slide, one thing that we have not included here, just because of time, is the regional makeup. And so I think in one of the earlier presentations, you saw that from a startup perspective, Dar es Salaam is still the main base. And similarly, you observe that ESOs are also more prevalent in Dar es Salaam at around 63%. And then the next up is Morogoro at 8%, right? So still there's a big focus on urban centers, and the big urban center being Dar es Salaam. Then after Dar es Salaam and Morogoro, you then have the Arushas, Tanga, Mwanza, Mbeya, Kilimanjaro between 1% and 4% in terms of the geographic spread. But then outside of those urban areas and peri-urban areas, almost none whatsoever. So it's good to start with what is working well. I already mentioned the growth. We did see out of the ESOs surveyed, 42% have been established in the last few years. So that is a lot of progress that we're seeing, and interest in investing in ESOs. We also see more specialized ESOs. So when you look at startups, there's an increase in the number of agri startups, for example, agri-specific startups and tech startups. We also see the similar trend when it comes to ESOs, a few supporting specific industries. More startups are consuming services and technical assistance from local ESOs. We also see a bit more in non-urban areas. And also some good progress when it comes to nurturing the early stages of the venture life cycle. Now let's take a look at the gaps, the capacity gaps on the next slide. And so at a very high level, there are 6 main categories that we did identify. Skills and long-term financial sustainability were the most prominent in terms of root causes. Skills in terms of ESOs having industry-specific specialized skills and experienced resources that can actually provide technical assistance to startups that would add value. So when you're moving away from the early stages where you're training and supporting startups on things like ideation and so forth, which there's a lot of at the moment, and now you're helping them scale, you need to actually have an understanding of the industry. So that's an area that needs to be looked at. Long-term financial sustainability was a very strong theme, probably the strongest theme when it comes to capacity gaps. Most of the ESOs rely on funding from donors and grants-based funding, and as a result, they're not sustainable. They also tend to align their strategies to the funder's strategy, and so you have less strategic technical assistance happening from being conducted from ESOs to startups. There's very limited diversity in funding, and this also is related to skills. So the ability to actually mobilize resource and having leaders in ESOs that understand what it takes and how to get this kind of funding. Tailored support from startups. If you speak to startups, especially those that are scaling, this is a big one. An interesting insight, a lot of the advanced startups that are doing relatively well, will tell you that they prefer not to get services from local ESOs, right? So they're looking internationally for more experienced support. So that is something that also needs to be looked at, and it ties back to the first around skills, having those industry-specific skills, specialized skills in ESOs to be able to provide that support. Collaboration and partnerships is big. There's very, very little collaboration in the ecosystem amongst ESOs. So a lot of competition and lack of trust. But it also has to do with limited platforms and forums for these ESOs to work together. Operational capacity also has come up in terms of a need to strengthen things like financial management skills, governance skills, monitoring and evaluation, and also leadership and strategic focus. And so the ability to have an entrepreneurial DNA, even in leading an ESO. So these are just some of the key highlights. Moving on to recommendations, our report details recommendations, including observations and examples that we've seen from other regions and other countries. But we grouped our recommendations into 4 areas. The first being improving service provision, so the way that ESOs are actually providing these services to startups, fostering better financial sustainability, building their skills and capacity, as well as strengthening the enabling environment. We also did a bit of work looking at the enabling environment, but did not go through that in detail in today's. If you go back to the last slide, just to touch on some of the key recommendations around improving service provision, leveraging partnerships. We see an opportunity there. For instance, ESOs partnering with funders or partnering with corporates to enhance the value that they provide to startups. There's very few ESOs that are doing that at the moment. Some I see in the room at the moment, but that's a model that has worked quite well. Results-oriented, tailored service provision. So looking at how we can embed KPIs and M&E frameworks to better measure the outcomes that ESOs are providing. We also have an opportunity to expand the geographical reach. Of course, that will take some investment to have some ESOs in some of the non-urban areas, because there is innovation happening there, but very little support. From a financial sustainability perspective, strategic focus in investments. So that is looking at directing funding to more strategic areas rather than just leaning towards whatever your funder is saying. Potential to explore milestone-based financing. When it comes to diversifying funding, here we did share some example alternative funding models that can be explored that we've seen work well in other parts of the world. For instance, revenue sharing and success-based financing. There's also some interesting models like accelerator as a service, working with corporates. And of course, investing in sustainable ESO models that also involve partnerships like with universities or corporates. I think with capacity building, this is relatively straightforward. I do want to touch on improving exposure for ESOs. So some interesting models that we've seen where we have exchange programs for ESOs with some members going to visit other international players and bringing that experience back. Yes, and the enabling environment, one point I want to highlight is around regulation and legal framework for ESOs. So we're aware there isn't one for startups either, but there is an opportunity to establish, to recognize ESOs, even if we're looking at the startup policy. So in the startup policy or a separate policy, but recognizing ESOs and the standards of ESOs to help improve the quality of the services that they provide. So that is just a snapshot of the recommendations, but when you get a chance to go through the report, you'll be able to go through those in more detail. And then I'd like to finish off with just a summary of some critical success factors that we feel ESOs can consider in being able to effectively provide services to startups. One, of course, is considering leadership and how leadership should have that entrepreneurial DNA. ESOs are, in many cases, startups as well, but we're seeing that missing. So that's something that needs to be looked at. Having a strategic focus and not just blowing with the wind in terms of funding. ESOs that have taken this strategic focus are doing much better. They've had to say no sometimes at opportunities that seem very good in the short term, but in the long term, they end up progressing quite well. Leveraging partnerships is also important. Not thinking of yourself as an ESO as a one-man show, but being able to collaborate with entities like corporates or universities or funders, so that you can bring more value to what you're bringing to startups. And of course, tailored services is linked to that. In terms of the operations of ESOs, looking to strengthen financial management, governance, monitoring, and evaluation, but also being more results oriented. And finally, diversifying funding, which is not easy. I know some of the ESO founders and leaders here will say that it's easier said than done, right? So it's definitely not easy to do any of these things, and it takes a lot of work. But we have seen a number of success stories, including in Tanzania. So with that, I'll close, and I just want to appreciate again your attention, and I hope some of the insights will add some value. Thank you.